These are the things that I'm going to cover in the next about an hour. We're going to just give you some brief information on the dynamics of domestic violence. We're going to talk a little bit about how to recognize signs and symptoms of domestic violence, and then we'll finish up looking at what appropriate interventions are there for working with families that are experiencing this issue. So the first thing I throw up is a case scenario, which is a pretty common case scenario with add in kind of your own extra pieces. So just to read that out loud, I'll read that out loud for you. A woman is being abused by her husband. Tonight he threatens to kill his entire family. The children are upstairs and they hear him say this. They believe him as they have seen the results of his abuse time and time again on their mother. The children's mother, the victim, calls her husband's cousin to come over and help to calm him down. This works at least for now. Like I said, it's a pretty common scenario. Depending on the work that you do and where you come from, add in substance abuse, add in a specific cultural background. But all in all, we tend to see abuse kind of manifest in this way. We'll come back and revisit this scenario a little bit at the end of the presentation today, but just want to get some initial thoughts from you. What do you think, or what comes to mind when you look at this scenario? We haven't had enough sugar. We're falling asleep. Not yet. Don't worry, I'll make it worth your while. Truthfully, what's the first thing that popped into your head? Kids? What's going on with them? Where are they? We hear a lot of law enforcement, a lot of different people say, we hear victims say oftentimes that my child was sleeping, they didn't know it happened, they didn't hear it. When in reality, what do we know? They do, right? They always hear it, and they're probably hiding under the bed or in the closet. Okay. What else comes to mind?
Mom continues to put up with it.
Mom continues to put up with it? Okay.
The children have seen it time and time again, and now cousin comes over and calls and calms them down, and everything's okay. We'll just keep going right down this road.
Okay. So in essence with that as well, is it's going to happen again?
I'm concerned that mom's resource is the abuser's family, because my gut reaction on seeing that is that mom is isolated and her only resource may be husband and his family.
Yeah. And so that might be why she's putting up with it, because where else can I go? And and we'll talk about it a little bit as we go, why perhaps she's staying or what's going on in that. And I think you picked up on something no one else has picked up on, the isolation factor. So we'll talk about that as well. Great. So when we look at domestic violence and we look at child welfare, here's a couple of statistics from you that are statewide, that are Nebraska specific. 9,336 children were served by domestic violence and sexual assault programs in the state of Nebraska in a year. 14,282 hours were provided to children and youth, and 4,898 hours of other, so versus the support and advocacy time that was spent other things. So running groups or maybe doing child care services, something like that was also something that was done within that year's time per the coalition's annual report. When we kind of spread it out and we look, oh, go ahead.
And all that service to the youth, where are the abusers in this? Are they out of the picture?
Generally, what we're talking about here is domestic violence and sexual assault programs. So these are generally your shelters where victims are staying with their children or where victims have gone to seek assistance. So these programs aren't serving the perpetrators. Does that answer your question?
Well, partially, but once they're out of the shelter, where do they go?
Where do they go? We're going to talk about that. Sometimes back, right? Yeah. So from a national perspective, this is what some of the statistics tell us. 40% of families with domestic violence also experience some form of child maltreatment. Another study by Fantuzzo and Moore in 1999 stated that it indicated that anywhere between 45 and 70% of children exposed to domestic violence are also victims of physical abuse. I've seen other studies that have said in 50% of the cases where there's domestic violence, there's also child abuse. So we kind of see the statistics range a little bit in relationship to this population and where they're going and where we're seeing those incidences of violence on both sides. For the purposes of moving forward with the presentation, this is the definition that I'm going to work from. We've heard it called domestic violence, it's called intimate partner violence. Some people are now talking about calling it coercive control. But essentially what I'm talking about is a pattern of behaviors. So that's key. It's a pattern, it's not a one-time event, that are done to establish and demonstrate this power and control. So I'm doing these activities, I'm doing these behaviors so that I can have power and control over. Another key piece is my intimate partner. A lot of people look at domestic violence and they think that it's parent to child or child to child, brother and sister, but really what we're talking about here for the purposes of this presentation are those intimate partners. And the reason why I make that distinction is the power inherent, or the dynamics inherent in that relationship. Your relationship with the person that you love has an intensity to it, has a power to it. So that impacts your ability and the choices that you make. So that's a key piece. The coercive control piece, or the coercive behavior that's also bolded on the screen, is another thing that we look at when we talk about domestic violence. What they're seeing now is fewer and fewer domestic violence batterers are using physical violence. They are able to control and maintain that power and control in a variety of other ways. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. What we see in batterers or in domestic abuse perpetrators, that's the majority of who we see within the criminal justice system, which is kind of the side that I come from. We see some situational people, some people that beat their partner or have hit their partner on a singular occasion or a one-time thing, maybe because of drugs and alcohol. We've seen increases of violence in intimate partners because of meth, but those people are also generally violent with other people, that kind of stuff. So we tend to see domestic violence offenders, if they're the people that we see with a domestic abuse or domestic assault, tends to be about 80% of the time this population. Again, we identify that based off of a history and pattern of behaviors within that individual. It's identifiable because of the violence that they have. They're choosing to be violent. The story that I use in a lot of trainings is the domestic violence abuser who gets angry at work does not hit his boss. The domestic violence abuser that gets pulled over on his way home from work does not hit the law enforcement officer, does not hit the cop. But when they get home, they make a choice based off of what they're feeling, what they're thinking, what they want to do to make themselves feel better or feel better, I guess. They make a choice to batter their partner because they know that that's a safe person that they can batter. So it's a conscious choice, and so it's a learned behavior, and that's the approach that we take in addressing it. How many of you have seen the power and control wheel? Some of you. There is a handout, because it's really hard to see, especially if in your PowerPoint it's teeny tiny. You do have a handout of a power and control wheel. So if you would, just pull that out of your packet for me and take a look at that. I'm a wanderer, so I'm really struggling not walking across the bright light here.
Where did you get that definition from, the coercive behavior? Because that's not necessarily the same as your batterer.
In terms of?
I have some specific situations where there is a situation where it may look like mom is the victim when mom is actually using various DV tools
Manipulation.
and manipulation to control dad.
Okay.
When there hasn't.
Yeah.
When there's been maybe one incident of aggression, which was
Both
mutual.
parties, sure. Well, the theory and the research on coercive control is by a gentleman named Evan Stark. He has a book called Coercive Control, and he talks about it and relates it back to kidnapping and the effects of kidnapping and the victims identifying with the perpetrator in that. And so that's where he comes from, prisoners of war, that kind of world. So it's a really good, interesting theory, but it's relatively new. So when you're looking at that power and control wheel, I just want some feedback from you. What on that wheel is illegal? What's an arrestable offense? Threats. Yep, that's about terroristic threats tends to be something that we see get charged. What we know about the power and control wheel is that this is a theory that was created in 1984 in Duluth, Minnesota, where they sat down with a bunch of victims of domestic violence and said, what are your experiences? What's going on? What do you feel like is happening in your world? And this is what the victims came up with. And what they said is, these are the most common tactics that my batterer uses to control what I do, or to tell me how to behave, or to make me change what I'm doing. And the reason why I asked that question about what's an arrestable offense, the majority of those behaviors are not illegal. It's not illegal for me to call my partner names, but it has an impact. It's not illegal for me to make her move away from her family so that she only has my family to depend on, but it has an impact. It's not illegal for me to tell her she's crazy and what she thought happened didn't really happen. It's not illegal for me to minimize her in front of her children. Those are all tactics that are used to create someone and to put them in a place where it's not that they're putting up with it, it's that they don't know anything else and they don't know how to get out of it. Okay, so these are very common tactics. And we'll come back to some of these theories. I wanted you to have that as a handout because these are the behaviors that you're going to see in batterers. These are the things that they're going to do to gain that control and to be abusive to their partner. We had a case in Lancaster County where the perpetrator would just leave a bullet on the kitchen counter every day when he went to work. It's not illegal for me to have a bullet in my house, but what message did I send, right? I worked with a gentleman who, this is one of my favorite stories, I think I share it in every presentation. His wife was 8 months pregnant, and it's July, and he wanted to go for a walk, but he didn't like to leave her by herself because who knew what she could get into, so he wanted her to go with him. She's 8 months pregnant, it's July. I have never been pregnant myself, but I can only imagine how much I would not want to go for a walk at that point in time, right? So she said, no, I don't want to go for a walk. He went out, grabbed a bug bomb out of the garage and set it off inside the house. She had to go outside. It's a very manipulative behavior, but it's not illegal, but it sent a message. So that's the key. These are some of the motives that a lot of domestic violence abusers have or batterers have to behave the way that they want to. We see rewards that outweigh consequences, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But primarily they behave that way, they choose that behavior because they can, again, because there's little consequences and there's many rewards. These are all the things that a domestic violence batterer gets. They get a cook, they get somebody to do their laundry, they get somebody to have sex with them whenever they want, somebody to clean their house, somebody to take care of their kids, somebody who's my partner and is by my side at all times. And then I also get this amazing feeling of power by what I'm doing. I mean, heck, if I could just get somebody to clean my house, I'd probably be pretty excited at this point in time, right? So they're getting all of that. So the consequences that we have may not outweigh the benefits of my behavior, right? I mean, that's kind of the theory behind punishment, is we want to punish to the point where they change their behavior because they don't want to get punished anymore. Until we have a punishment that matches all of my benefits, it's going to be hard for me to change from that perspective, okay? Yeah?
What does the victim get? I mean, they go to a shelter, they get treatment, they get help, they get education, they understand the power cycle, the phenomena, and then they go back. What do they get?
What do they get out of that relationship? You know, I think that ranges. I think some people feel like they feel wanted, they feel needed. I've worked with women who felt like they were the only person in the world who could be with this person, and they felt guilty if they left. I've worked with a lot of people who went back primarily because they can't afford rent. They can't afford the bills. They can't afford childcare on their own. So what they get sometimes is an extra income or health insurance, stuff like that. So it kind of depends on each case. I don't know. I mean, it's kind of a big question. So we'll talk a little bit more about it. So we'll see if I can answer it a little bit better in a minute. These are the types of abuse. I don't want to go into it a ton for you because you have it in your slide, but I wanted you to have this so that you would have it available to you. Emotional abuse, it says up here, helping her better herself. The best example I have of that in the beginning stages of an abusive environment is don't wear that dress, it makes you look fat, or you look like a whore, go change, that kind of stuff, where it has that kind of tinge of a put down, but it still is masked by I'm helping you, okay? Verbal abuse is pretty self-explanatory. Sexual abuse, I would say 90 to 95% of the women I worked with were probably sexually assaulted within their marriage, but they didn't identify it. Anytime that if you think about what you do after a big fight, right? Most people have what's called make-up sex, or they have this kind of reunifying event. For a lot of domestic violence victims, that's not a choice for me at that point. I just got battered, I just got yelled at, I just got completely afraid and frightened of my partner. I likely am not going to choose to have this intimate moment with them. And so we see a lot of victims that are sexually abused but don't identify it because they also see that that's part of a relationship and that's part of what I'm supposed to do. And then physical abuse I put on here last because that's probably the one that most people jump to when they think about domestic violence. But notice I put on here a couple of different types of physical abuse. Reckless driving is one we see a lot. It is a form of physical abuse, but a lot of people don't identify it. Driving crazily, driving into the other lane, threatening that way is something we see. It's pretty common. This is a theory called the progression of violence that's fairly new in the field of domestic violence, where it talks about the progression or what we see happen over time. So a lot of domestic violence that we see when it's identified in early stages are what we call pre-battering. So it's breaking objects. Essentially what that is they're choosing their partner's objects, right? They don't go to the mantle and choose their prized trophy from when they were a child. No, they're going to choose their wife's grandmother's teacup. And that's what they're going to break. So again, it's that obviousness that it is a choice and that it is a thought-out behavior. They'll threaten some violence, but primarily it's verbal at that point. The next level then is beginning violence. So that's the pushing, the restraining, standing in their way, kind of the physical power, showing that to them, some holding down, and a little bit of shaking. Then it moves into the moderate level. There it's more slapping, punching, they're getting more physical, pulling hair, spanking. Then severe gets to the point where their actions could be deadly. Strangulation is one. We hear a lot of people call it choking. Strangulation it takes 5 pounds of pressure in a dominant hand to fully cut off and to kill someone in about, I think it's 30 seconds or less, okay? The average male has about 80 pounds of pressure in their dominant hand. So it's not a difficult task to really cause long injury. Besides the fact, think of the message that it sends. With one hand, I can impact you, I can end your life. It's a very frightening, obvious event for a lot of victims. We see sometimes batterers may jump. They will progress in their violence oftentimes based off of need. So if I'm not getting the response I want by breaking objects, I might jump to restraining. If I don't think that's going to do it, I might jump to slapping, punching, or kicking. Okay? Some people jump all the way. Some people you don't see this progression. What we see, though, we do see this in some. So that's obviously why it's a theory and where it came out. We're seeing it more and more in terms of being able to identify it. The hard part is we don't begin to see it from a systems perspective until 3. So that's why we don't always identify it in the earlier stages. For a lot of victims of domestic violence, we've talked a lot about the batterers. So for a lot of victims, what we see is this fear of leaving. There's a lot of different barriers, like we talked about this morning. What's in the work that you do, what's the most common intervention for domestic violence? Not from a criminal perspective, but if you're working with a family or if this family is a part of the child welfare system and they identify domestic violence, what's the most common intervention or response? Anger management. Separate them. I heard something over here. Shelter. Get her out to shelter. Okay. Exactly. What we tend to see as a most common response is a separation, getting them away from each other. The hard part is we don't often take into account these barriers. Why that separation may be difficult, why they go back, or what they get out of it. A lot of victims don't leave. Yeah, go ahead.
Speaking of that, and it goes back to one of what this gentleman was saying, when you've got a woman who's isolated, maybe her family is in Texas.
Absolutely.
She's here, his family is here.
Child services comes in, they remove the child, they look for family placement, it goes to his family.
Mm-hmm.
If she wants that child back.
You have to make amends.
And
Yeah.
then I think that's huge.
I agree. I think that's a huge reason. I put up fear up here, and I think that goes to what you were saying as well. Some of them feel fear for themselves, but some of them feel fear for their children, or the fear of never getting to see my children again. A lack of support if I'm isolated. Financial is huge. Some of them often see that there's a mix of good times with the bad. So they look at it and say, yeah, sometimes he hits me, but he's really good with the kids. Okay, but he's hitting you in front of the kids. So help me understand, right? And then the last one up here is love. It's kind of a sick and twisted love in some cases, but it's love. It may be the first person who ever made me feel like I was beautiful, even for that 5 minutes, because 10 minutes later he told me how ugly I was, but for 5 minutes I felt beautiful, and I want to hold on to that. So those are the big reasons. I would say most of the women that I worked with when I worked with victims, fear was a big one. Fear of the unknown. I worked with a victim who didn't want to leave. I got her a place in shelter, got her a way out. She didn't want to leave because she looked at me and she said, I know what he'll do to me if I stay. If I leave, I don't know what's going to happen, and I can't do that. But I would say a big one is financial. I had so many victims that went back because they didn't have the resources to stay away, because all they had was his family, or they couldn't get into housing in time, or the bills got out of hand, they didn't have health insurance. Whatever the reason, it tends to be financial for a lot of people. Think about earlier when you were listening to Pamela talk about substance abuse. Think about the image of the brain that she put up on the screen and what it looked like a month after stopping taking drugs. I think it was meth, right? Okay. You could see from that picture the level of functioning and how that level of functioning was impacted, right? Now you compound that, though, with fear and substance abuse, ongoing substance abuse, and trauma. Okay, so I may be off the meth, but I'll probably still drink because that's what I'm going to choose to use to cope with what's going on with me. I'm afraid all the time, so I'm a little hypersensitive, and I've been traumatized because this person who said they were going to love me forever has beat me up several occasions. All of that impacts decision making. All of that impacts, if I'm hypersensitive, it's going to be hard for me to think about a budget and to think through this long kind of linear way of thinking because I've been traumatized the way that I have. So that impacts, again, it's a barrier to leaving because I can't think in that way. I'm not there yet. What we also see is that we see a lot of violence post-separation. So we want them to separate because we know we have to get the kids out of that environment. We just have to because there's an impact and we don't want the kids to be in a dangerous environment. What we do know about domestic violence and what a lot of the research has said around people who are murdered by their intimate partner is that a victim's risk of death goes up 75% when they try to leave or when they're successful at leaving. You see a lot of stalking behaviors at that point in time. A lot of the victims of domestic violence that have been murdered across the country have been murdered post-separation. It's a very risky time for them. What we also see, protection orders. A lot of people feel that a protection order is a solution for a lot of victims. I will say to you, I've seen on some case plans, I've seen Law enforcement does this quite a bit where they require somebody to get a protection order. I'm not going to come back out next time unless you get a protection order. Protection orders are good because it gives law enforcement something to arrest for. So if he's doing those behaviors on that wheel that are not arrestable, but I have a protection order, likely they can arrest. The hard part is that a lot of case plans or a lot of law enforcement officers say you have to go out and get a protection order. That's not up to the victim. That's not up to law enforcement. Whether or not I'm given a protection order is up to a judge. And there's specific definitions and there's specific requirements whether or not I can even qualify for that protection order. So that becomes very difficult. Besides the fact, protection orders can be dangerous for a lot of victims. And I'm kind of going off on a tangent. It's a whole other training, so I won't go into it for too long. But if you think about the fact, so here's somebody who's been beating me up, I'm trying to leave, I'm trying to get away from, so I go get a protection order. Because of the way our system is set up, everything I write in that petition is now served upon the person who I'm afraid of. That can create danger, can create fear. So for a lot of victims, protection orders aren't the best approach. For a lot of victims, they are. For a lot of victims, they aren't. It just depends. Another place where we see violence and danger post-separation is through visitation. A lot of perpetrators obviously have access to their victim through visitation, either whether it's through the exchange. We saw violence kind of went up at places like Wendy's and McDonald's and rest areas because of those exchanges. They're a very dangerous time for a lot of victims because it's an opportunity for me to be back with that person and to try and get all of those benefits that I had before. We also see abuse through a supervised visitation, passing of notes, or a simple conversation with a child that says, I can come home, but it's up to mom. Mom's the one that makes the decision whether or not I can come home, so if you really want me to come home, you gotta talk to mom. And what a horrible conversation that is between a mother and a child as to why dad can't come home. We also see a lot of child abductions, and a lot of the child abductions we see across the United States are as a result of domestic violence relationships. What we also see within abusers' use of children, this can be done obviously during the relationship or post-separation, these types of activities. Again, as well as breaking the belongings of the victim, they might destroy the belongings of the child and then say something like, well, if your mom had only done this, I wouldn't have had to do that. And with belongings, I also include in their pets. We see a lot of animal abuse and pet abuse, child's dog or cat because of that. Requiring the children to report on mom's activities post-separation. So I saw a car outside the other day. Who's mom been seeing? Who's mom been talking to? What's mom doing? That kind of stuff can be detrimental for a child. So if a supervised visitation worker doesn't understand the dynamics of domestic violence, they're not going to identify those questions as dangerous and as problematic. Undermining the mother's authority, telling, Johnny, you don't have to clean your room, that's mom's job. I don't care what mom said, you're going to do what I say. Showing favoritism, we see this in two different ways. We see batterers kind of groom their sons in a way to see women in a certain light. We also see batterers groom their daughters to the point where they think that they are the best woman ever or the best little girl and that they don't want to be anything like mom because dad doesn't like mom, so I'm not going to be like mom. So they start to shame mom. And if you think about it, think about kids. How many of you have little kids? Or have had children that have been little at one point in time, right? When you think about a 5-year-old or under 5-year-old, what do they watch on TV? That's a real question. Cartoons, right? My nephew, who's 5, loves superheroes. He loves Batman, he loves Superman, he loves them, okay? When you watch a superhero or you watch one of those cartoons, you see the biggest, strongest guy who always wins the fight is the good guy. So when I'm at home and I see the biggest, strongest guy who always wins the fight, he's the good guy. There's a really hard thing for a lot of little kids to kind of understand maybe he's not the good guy. And so it's a hard conversation, or it's a hard thing that they're thinking through in their brain. These are some of the things that children experience or as a result of what they experience. These are some of the things that we see in children. They may feel guilt and shame because they feel some responsibility. If I had only cleaned up my room, and if I had only done this, Dad wouldn't have gotten so mad. We see some alcohol and drug use in teenagers as they get older. We see some with PTSD as a result as well of growing up in that kind of household. What we also see that is amazing about children is how resilient they can be. So many children, they say that if I grow up in domestic violence, I'm going to be a batterer. We aren't seeing the statistics that prove that. There is a certain number, there is a percentage, but we're seeing more and more children that are resilient to the domestic violence, that actually recover from it and become very good, productive people in our society. These are some of the things that children talk about or that they say that they feel as a result of domestic violence. And in order to increase that resiliency, these are some of the protective factors that can assist them in that. So having an increased level of social competence, having friends, being a little bit more outgoing, so you have some supports beyond your internal family. Their level of intelligence, being able to understand what's going on, high self-esteem, outgoing temperament. If you've done any kind of research with children or on children, these are the same protective factors you see almost in anything, I would think, for kids. If they have these things, they're going to be more resilient to a lot of the traumatic or a lot of the bad things that could happen to them. Above all, with domestic violence, though, is this last one. Having a supportive relationship with my non-abusing parent is huge in increasing resiliency as a protective factor for children who are growing up in this environment. Being able to sustain, maintain, and retain that relationship is huge for them. Other things that impact a children's experience of violence, how severe the violence was, what their developmental level was. Obviously, if they're younger, it's going to be harder for them to understand, so they may be more impacted by it. How much time has passed since that violent incident? The longer I'm away, the better I am, essentially. Boys and girls obviously process different events differently. And then whether or not I was physically abused or sexually abused, as that obviously has an impact on whether or on how intensely I've been impacted by what's going on at home. So what do we do? So I've kind of given you all of the depressing things, and I'm gonna work up to the happy piece in a little bit. Don't worry. So what do we do about this? How do we deal with it? Essentially, what we have to deal with when we're working with domestic violence is, in order to have an impact, we have to address the problem. And the problem is the batterer. The hard part is, in the child welfare system, you don't always have access to the batterer, right? Because the batterer is the cause of violence, that's why we need to have access to the batterer. The criminal justice system tends to be the most common response to the batterer, and then the child welfare system tends to be the response on the other side, for the victim or for the children. So until both systems kind of work together, we're creating a little bit of a disconnect. Because if you think about it, how long does it take after an incident? Let's say an incident of violence occurs and a report is made that the children were there for domestic violence and the children were removed. How long does it take before that mom is engaged in case planning and in services? Average. Give me a ballpark. The silence is killing me, guys. A couple of weeks, maybe a month? You're just staring at me. Okay, we're going to say it's a couple of weeks or a month, okay? We'll just go with me, okay? Those of you that have experience in the criminal justice system, how long before that incident or that offender is sentenced and is punished? 6 months. Some jurisdictions it's 9 months to a year. So that's where the disconnect happens. This thing happened to me. I mean, think about it from a victim's perspective. This thing happened to me. I'm doing everything I can to get my kids back, and nothing is happening because that's what they perceive. There's things happening. There might be hearings happening. There might be different things going on in the criminal justice system. But for 6 to 9 months, I'm working, and I'm not seeing anything. Okay? So that's where that disconnect happens. So it's important, if you're still working on a case and that person's on probation, which is the most common response we see to domestic violence abusers, having communication with probation so that the victim or the family or the kids can know what's going on so they don't feel that disconnect. Or helping out with the pre-sentence investigation, sharing information in that way so that there can be some connection between those two systems, because it gets very hard for a lot of people. They don't see that connection and they don't feel like the punishment is happening. The thing to keep in mind is that batterers will continue to do what they can to keep what they have or what they want. So for those of you that are working and are trying to keep these parties apart and are trying to provide that level of protection, the hard part about that is because I'm the batterer and it's 9 months before or 6 months before I get to sentencing, I don't really have anything that's telling me that I can't go over there. I might have a criminal no contact, may have that. Maybe there is a protection order against me, but in my brain, that's not enough. That's not going to be a lot to keep me away or to get what I have, okay? So that makes your job harder. So until we can deal with the problem, until we kind of get these systems to work together, it's going to be hard to really address that fully. So the key for you is that interventions focus solely on the victim and the child do not or may not impact the problem, especially if the batterer or the offending party is a non-biological. So it's mom's boyfriend. You have nothing you can do about mom's boyfriend, right? From a child welfare perspective. That really makes this hard. I will give good news, I promise. I know I keep getting depressing, but I promise I will give some interventions that will help you. So these are just some signs of domestic violence from a victim perspective that are there for you. You have, obviously, on the PowerPoint for you to look at. One of the things up here, injuries during pregnancy, is something to keep an eye out for. Because in general, most batterers are smarter than we want to give them credit for sometimes. They know that to stay with the beatings in the swimsuit area, so from neck to navel, because that's a less likely place that people will see bruising and injury. So I've seen a lot of victims with back bruises. Strangulation actually rarely bruises. You don't see a lot of bruises from that, so that's another place we see a lot of abuse, but they tend to stay in places where it can't be seen. And then I brought that up with pregnancy because we also see violence increase with pregnancy. So if my primary battering is in places that aren't seen, and my partner is pregnant, that increases danger, obviously. We see battering increase during pregnancy because my partner, who's always been doting on me and has done everything I want, now has something else they're focusing on. And that, I don't like that, because I'm losing some of what I want, okay? So that's something we see. So if you are working with people and you suspect domestic violence and there's a pregnancy, it's something to keep an eye out for. Victim behaviors, some of the telltale signs, because a lot of victims I worked with were told that they couldn't make eye contact or couldn't look up, so they wouldn't make eye contact with me. They constantly looked down because they knew that if they happened to make eye contact with a male in the room, somebody would see that and somebody would know. That immediately means I'm cheating or I'm doing something I shouldn't do. A lot of victims would try to just minimize themselves and get as small and as withdrawn into themselves as they could to not draw attention. Is another behavior I see. Stiffness, or they might be hypersensitive, so quick movement on your part might make them jump pretty big. Child behaviors, I don't want to go into a lot of detail because there's actually a handout you have that breaks down domestic violence, child behaviors, or children who witness domestic violence by age. And that's a really great handout. So that's there for you to be able to look at and to refer back to. Overall, though, we see anything from shame and self-blame. We see this aggression. It may even be passivity. With kids, it's hard to say. We see the ranges. We see the people that are going to do everything they can to excel at school because they don't want to mess up, to the people that completely withdraw and don't participate whatsoever. So you see the ranges. What I would say for those of you that have worked with kids and have been a part of working with kids in this system, you're going to recognize the signs, because it's the signs that you recognize of impact, of things happening to those children. You know what you're looking for, and you'll know it when you see it. But that handout just gives you a great breakdown of some things to look for. Some other things is they might be tired, they might sleep through school, they might fall asleep, especially if they're up listening to arguments late at night. We see bedwetting, all of that kind of stuff in kids. From a perpetrator perspective, again, these are things that you'll likely not see. Perpetrators do what we call, they have an outside face and an inside face. So they have the face that they show to everybody else, and then the face that they show to their partner and their family. I can't tell you the number of times I have heard, well, John wouldn't do that. John's a really good guy. You know, he's an upstanding member of our community. He's just an awesome person. Well, let me tell you what John did last night to his wife, who I just visited in the hospital, okay? We see that oftentimes because they are so controlled, they know who they can reveal that to and who they can't. There's a baseball player who was a pitcher, and I'm not an athlete or a sports person, so I don't know the team. I can't give you details. But he's a pitcher, and he pitched a really bad game, and he walked off. He was taken off of the mound, I think in like the 7th inning, which made him mad because he couldn't finish the game. So he walked off the field, and he punched a brick wall and broke his left hand. And you know, he came before the press and was apologizing, saying, I'm really sorry, I shouldn't have done that. And the press was like, you know, we noticed that you're a right-handed pitcher, but yet you punched with your left hand. And he said, well, I'm not going to break my right hand. I'm not going to break my pitching hand. So it was this big event that I lost control and I punched the wall and I was so angry. But he had the wherewithal to know, don't punch with the right? If you were really losing control and you lost it because of your anger and you punched something, you'd punch with your dominant hand. That's just normal. That's just humanity. So we see that in the same way. If I'm losing control and I'm angry and I lash out, I'm going to punch whatever. I'm going to punch whatever's in front of me. With domestic violence, we don't see that. So it's not as open. It's not as in our face. Some of the things you might see is if it hasn't been identified yet, take a look at who's doing the talking. A lot of victims will kind of get permission. They'll look at their partner and then see, can I answer that? Is that okay? And then answer, or they might be hesitant in their response. Some strict gender roles, but primarily those things that you see on the power and control wheel are those things that help you know what's going on. There's a couple of resources in your packet. There's a bar association checklist that helps you identify when you're looking at cases, helps you identify whether or not domestic violence is present. There's a lot of different things. I'll get to resources at the end, but there's a lot of different things that they have that will help you. So now to the good news, the interventions. What works for you? What interventions can we do that will have the impact that we want? So the first one that's the most obvious is increasing the children's safety. I want to encourage you to look for all of the ways to increase a child's safety. In some cases, it may not be removing, and in some cases, it may not be forcing separation. Now, I know that's, don't throw rocks at me yet, okay, I'll get there, but that's just something to consider. Consider those dangers, consider all of the dynamics and what's going on. One way is to safety plan. Domestic violence shelters and advocates do this regularly and can be a resource for you in helping you with this. Talking with the children about, so when mom and dad get in a fight, where can you go? Don't hide underneath the cupboard in the bathroom. How about you go next door to Joyce's house and stay with Joyce for a little while? Setting that up with the child. Don't hide underneath your bed. Don't hide in the closet. Where can you go? I worked with a lot of victims where we create code words for the family. So she knew where this was going to go in a few minutes, so she'd say, Johnny, why don't you go downstairs and get a loaf of bread? And Johnny knew that was the cue to go to Joyce's house. Okay? Something like that are also ways to increase safety. May not be a best case scenario, but it is a way to increase safety. Also taking a look at the risk. What's going on? What level of violence are we at? What's going on with this family? Is this something that a smaller intervention could help with versus a larger intervention? A lot of child welfare agencies do that already, but it's just something to keep in mind. Another thing that works for you is protecting adult victims so they're not harmed by violence. Recognizing for that nonviolent parent what they may have already done to help protect their child or their children. In the case that we talked about, do I really want her to call her husband's cousin and say, can you come calm him down? No. But was that what she could do to protect at that point in time? Absolutely. Recognizing that, validating that can do so much for them to feel like they are getting some power back. Having culturally appropriate interventions. We see a lot of domestic violence in the Sudanese population and in other tribal cultures for a variety of reasons. So understanding that culture, understanding the process. When I worked in Omaha, we had a Sudanese victim who came into the hospital, and the only interpreter was her husband's cousin. I'm not letting him interpret. So, what can you do? And recognizing that, recognizing why that may be bad, or what's going on with that within that culture. What works for you? Promoting the parent's strengths. What is she doing that is working? I don't really want you to do that. I understand that that's what you did and that that's what you had resources for, but let me show you what other resources there are and what could help you do that better the next time. Not demeaning, obviously, that strength-based approach to a lot of what you're doing. If you think about it, that's my next one, I might jumping. Increasing those protective factors for children that we talked about. How can you help a child be more resilient? Helping them be more outgoing, helping them increase their self-esteem. All of those things can help increase those protective factors. Having community-based voluntary services. What we do right now is we take somebody who's been told what they can do, where they can go, and who they can talk to for a long time. We're taking them out of it because we're saying it's bad, and now we're telling them what they can do, where they can go, and who they can talk to, okay? That doesn't always help. That's not helping me become independent. That's not helping me understand what's going on in my head. So while I might say, I have to require you to do this as a part of your case plan, or we're gonna have to do this or that, what would you like to do, though, to help improve this situation? Is there something you would like to choose, or having them be a part of that process so they feel some ownership in it will, one, increase your success, but will increase their likelihood of feeling independent and able to stay away. Limited visitation with the violent parent. I'm obviously, I have some experience in it, but I'm a big fan of supervised visitation. Because of what we do in our system, we can't always say, no, you can't see your kids anymore because of the violence that you perpetrated against your wife. Having supervised visitation is a key and is a really good strategy. The key is, like I said earlier, making sure that those people that are supervising are trained in domestic violence so that they understand and are able to recognize those dynamics. The hard part with that is explaining it to the nonviolent parent. If you think about it, I'm told that I have to leave and that I have to separate because he's violent to me and I have to get away, and if I don't get away, my kids are going to be taken away from me. So now I'm away and I'm divorced, and now I'm being told that I have to let my kids see him, or I have to let my kids stay with him, even though I was told I couldn't be with him because he was too dangerous, but now my kids are staying with him for a weekend. I mean, it's very confusing to a lot of victims. But that's just the way that it goes. That's the system, and I'm not saying it shouldn't be that way, but it can be very confusing. So helping somebody understand, this is why this is this way, this is why we wanted you to get away, and this is why he still has rights, or why he still has the ability to be with his children, and why that's important as well. Giving that explanation and that understanding can be very empowering. Reinstating power and control to the victim over their own life and choices. We talked about that a little bit in terms of having those voluntary pieces. What I would encourage, when I talk with child welfare workers and when I train individuals that work with victims in a variety of capacities, what I want them to think is, how does this decision that I'm making impact the nonviolent parent? When I work with probation officers, we do that all the time. If this person wants to transfer to another jurisdiction, what's the impact on the parent? Or what's the impact on the victim of the crime? So I would encourage you to think about it that way as well. What's the impact you're having? And then above all, having accountability interventions for the batterer. Recommending better intervention program if you can. If you have so much power to require that other party to have some interventions, that might be something, like I said, collaborating with probation. But looking at those accountability interventions and how can the two systems work together so that that accountability is felt and those consequences occur. And then the last one up here is engaging local experts in the discussion. All of you have local experts in your communities that can help you look at the ways that you're doing the work that you're doing and how can you improve it from this perspective. So I encourage you to see if you can have them join your team, be a part of your team to represent that perspective in your community. What works against you? As I said, interventions that are focused solely on the victim don't impact the problem. Mandatory protection orders may not be the right choice for that individual. It's a possibility and it could be a suggestion as an option, but mandating that really can increase risk. Couples counseling, that's kind of a soapbox for me, but any time where you put somebody who's abusive in a room with a victim that's supposed to be a neutral, equal environment, it's not going to be a neutral, equal environment, and it's going to increase danger. If I go to counseling, I know I'm supposed to bare my soul and I'm supposed to share my whole life story with this person, so I do that, and then I get home and I get punished because I did it. Be careful of collusion. There's very subtle ways that people collude with batterers. They're the classic, give them an inch and they'll take a mile. Anything from them talking to you about and justifying their behaviors, and as simple as head nodding tells them, oh, they think I'm okay. If they see that from an attorney, if they see that from a judge, if they see that from a caseworker, somebody who's what they see in a position of power, they think, well, so-and-so said it was okay, so I now have permission and justification to keep doing it. They justify their behavior all the time, every day. It doesn't take a lot to continue to justify that. We had a probation officer, I had a victim that called me about a year ago and complained because she said, my husband's probation officer is taking him out for steak dinners. I highly doubt that your husband's probation officer is taking him out for steak dinners. One, they can't really afford that, so I highly doubt that they're taking him out for steak dinners. And so I'm talking to her, and I talked to the probation officer, and it was just something as simple as, oh, are you going there? Oh, okay, well, I'll see you. I'll probably see you there tonight. It was something as simple as that. It wasn't trying to be, it was a small community. They knew, that this event was going on in a small community. It happens. He didn't intend it, but that's what happens. You give them an inch and they'll take that mile. And then the no contact requirement for the victim. I'm a huge fan of a no contact requirement for the perpetrator, for the batterer. The no contact requirement for the victim is hard. They have had no control in that relationship, so what makes anyone think that they're going to be able to control them now? So it's not, now, and I realize I'm painting kind of the best picture perspective, so I realize these cases are messy. You have people that yell at you, you have people with substance abuse issues, you have people that abuse their kids. I get that. But the key, when you're dealing with domestic violence, if you can't keep them away, why do you think she would be able to keep them away? Or that nonviolent parent. If I'm terrified of someone, or if someone has threatened me, what makes you think I'm going to have the power to close the door in their face? Especially when they have the incentive to get through the doorway. So some resources for you in your area, Norfolk area, Bright Horizons. If you want to find out more detail, the Nebraska Statewide Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Coalition has resources. Every county in the state has domestic violence and sexual assault advocacy coverage. So if you want more information on resources in your area, that is the number to call. That is my email address. Because I'm the point of contact, I am your point of contact. If you have questions, if you want resources, I don't know everything. I know I look like I do, but I really don't. So I would be glad to refer you on or to look for other things for you to help you out. So please feel free to contact me. From a national perspective, the National Center or the National Council for Juvenile and Family Court Judges has some amazing resources in relationship to domestic violence. They have a judicial checklist for children and youth exposed to violence, and then the children exposure to domestic violence. I used a lot of that information for the presentation today, so there's some good stuff in those 2 books. Again, the American Bar Association has the checklist, and then I gave you a copy of the domestic violence checklist in your handouts. NNEDV, which is the National Network to End Domestic Violence, again, is a national resource, training and technical assistance resource. And then I put the domestic violence or the domestic abuse intervention program up here because that's where those power and control wheels come from. So if you want more information on those, that is that resource for you. Yes?
You identified the real problem as a batterer, and yet all the resources are for the victim. How effective are interventions for batterers, or are there any?
That's a really great question. It's hard to know. A lot of people want to look at the effectiveness or the success rates of batterer intervention programs. What those programs are, if you aren't familiar, it's an education program. So because domestic violence is a learned behavior, we have to help them unlearn it. So it's an educational program where they challenge thoughts. It's a cognitive behavioral program where they challenge the thoughts and the thinking errors. The hard part is because so much domestic violence is undetectable, I never really know how successful my program is. Because and I used to say this a lot when I would work with supervised visitation, and we'd get trained on how to go into a courtroom. And all I could testify to was for the 2 hours that person was in my building and I watched them in the visit, that's all I can testify to in terms of behavior. So that's all we can say from a batterer intervention program perspective. I can say how many people complete the program. I can say how many people share appropriate items within that 2-hour time span in the program, but I can't testify to what they're doing at home. Because they're so good at manipulation, because they're so good at justification, it's hard to know. There's been some studies done on batterer intervention programs that have said anywhere from 30 to 50% success in changing behaviors. Some people say that they have to go through it several times to achieve success on those programs, so it's hard to know. And this is my opinion, we need to get to a point where our consequences and our interventions are working together. We see in a lot of jurisdictions across the country a $45 fine or probation. Well, okay, I'm at 9 months probation or a $45 fine. $45 fine. Even 7 days in jail or probation for 9 months. I'd rather do the 7 days in jail. So until we see some of those things mesh together, as well as on the intervention side for the victims, some of those things have to come together and work together for us to see, I think, lasting change.
We have batterer intervention programs in Nebraska.
We do. Yes, you don't in Norfolk, unfortunately. But if you email me, I can give you a list of all the programs across the state. There's North Platte has programs, Lexington has programs, Columbus has a program that's actually really, really good and has a lot of positive information coming out of it. Fremont, a lot of different jurisdictions do, so I'd be happy to share that information with you. Just send me an email, and we have a whole list that we use through the courts, through probation. So let's jump back. I think I have 5 minutes. Am I okay? Okay. Let's jump back to our case scenario here. So again, we have a woman who's being abused by her husband, threatens to kill the family. Kids know it's happening because it's happened before. What are you thinking now after everything? And I realize I kind of just verbally vomited on all of you with all of that information. So what are you thinking now? Is it changed? Is it the same?
Well, we still don't have the piece where, how do we know that that we need to do anything? Because it hasn't been related to anybody.
Okay.
By that family.
Okay. Yeah, we don't even know if we would know about this. Is that what you're saying? Right. Okay. What do you think about what her choice is?
I'm struck with the fact that she thinks it's her responsibility to call someone to calm him down. It's not her responsibility.
Okay. I like that. I like that a lot. But people would tell you it is her responsibility.
I think she would see it as her responsibility if for no other reason than she's trying to protect those kids.
Mm-hmm. We also see from a national perspective, we talked about earlier the differences between the two criminal justice and the social and the child welfare system. From a national perspective, we see victims of domestic violence charged more and more with a failure to protect charge. and not a lot of charges on the perpetrating individual. And so that's where a lot of that kind of belief comes from. Also, it's from history. I'm supposed to be the caregiver for my children. I'm supposed to protect my children. So yeah, I mean, I agree with you. It highlights that we're not really focusing on the problem. And that was intentional, so nice job. Anything else? Above all, what I want you to see in this scenario, and I realize it's a very cleansed scenario, very sterile, is that she is trying to protect. She is trying to do some things. It's not what we would choose, and it may not be what we want her to do, but what we see with most victims of domestic violence is they're doing what they can to survive and to help their children survive. Oftentimes they don't have the tools because they've been isolated, because they may not have achieved the education level that they need to, for a lot of reasons. And so the big take home that I want you to have is to honor that. You may make the same choices, and you may not change the choices or the pathways that you've gone on before, but to recognize in a lot of these victims the struggles that they have, the reasons why they make the choices that they make, and that most times they're trying to make the right choice. They just either don't have the education, the skills, or the knowledge to know what those choices should be. And above all, I know that these cases are messy. They're not easy. It's hard to identify. You have victims of domestic violence that yell at you, that cry at you, that are drunk, that also hit their kids. So I know that I gave you a sterile picture, and I know that that's not reality. So, any questions? You're ready for your brownies and your trail mix and your soda. Since it was brought in, right?
You do understand that that works both ways. I mean, your entire presentation has been pretty gender specific.
Yes.
And you understand that there are women that are violent.
Yes.
Attack their children, attack their husbands.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the other message here is that you need to look at both sides of the story and make sure you're getting it right. Maybe you just have one violent person, it may be the wife, it may be the husband, girlfriend, boyfriend, or you have two violent people living together.
Yes, I agree, and I meant to say that, so thank you for bringing that up. What we are seeing statistically, it used to be about 95% male and 5% female. We are seeing that change. It's more like 80% male and 20% female. We're seeing more and more female perpetrators. The reasons for their violence are sometimes hard to decipher. Sometimes female perpetrators of domestic assaults are victims who fight back. Sometimes they're the batterers. And so that I agree with you, it's really hard. So you have to look at the full story to truly understand. Absolutely. Anything else? You really just want the brownies? Okay.